The day begins with sunlight filtering through the window, heralding the start of Emma's wedding day. The coastal breeze carries the scent of the ocean, signaling the beginning of a life-changing moment. The morning holds both excitement and anticipation as Emma prepares for the day ahead. The small coastal town comes to life with the preparation for Emma and Daniel's wedding. The streets are decorated with white ribbons, and the air is filled with the hum of activity as friends and family prepare for the grand event. The town shares in the celebration, reflecting on the couple's history and the significance of the day. As Emma looks at herself in the mirror, memories of her childhood with Daniel come flooding back. Flashbacks depict their early years as friends and the challenges they overcame together. Their relationship has been a constant presence in her life, making this moment of transition feel both thrilling and meaningful. Emma's mother helps her into her wedding gown, a symbol of the family's legacy. This moment, shared between mother and daughter, represents the passing of traditions and hopes for the future. It is a quiet but important exchange that highlights the bond between them and the significance of the day. With the wedding dress carefully adjusted, the final touches are made as Emma prepares for her walk down the aisle. Her bridesmaids help ensure every detail is perfect. As the distant sound of church bells rings out, it signals that the ceremony is about to begin. Emma, accompanied by her father, steps outside and begins the walk toward the church. The moment is a significant milestone in her life, marking the beginning of a new chapter. The procession is filled with anticipation as the couple approaches the venue where their future will begin. The church, standing proudly under the blue sky, welcomes Emma and her guests. The scene inside is one of tradition and celebration as friends and family gather to witness this important moment. As Emma walks toward the altar, the atmosphere is filled with the promise of a new beginning. But there is an underlying sense that something is about to change. Emma clutched her father's arm, her fingers trembling, despite her best efforts to steady them. The grand oak doors of the church creaked as they swung open, revealing a scene bathed in golden sunlight. Rays streamed through the towering stained glass windows, casting shimmering hues of ruby, sapphire, and emerald across the polished wooden floor. Gasps rippled through the congregation as guests rose to their feet, their eyes filled with admiration and joy. Emma barely noticed them. Her breath caught in her throat as she took the first step down the aisle. Time seemed to warp, each heartbeat echoing louder in her ears. Her gaze locked onto Daniel, standing tall at the altar. His dark hair was neatly combed, his tuxedo pristine. Yet his expression, normally so warm and inviting, was unreadable, as if a veil had dropped over his emotions. Emma's father gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice steady despite the sheen of tears in his eyes. With a resolute breath, Emma nodded, focusing on the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle. Each step brought her closer, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Joy mingled with nervous anticipation, creating a heady swirl of emotion. The world faded into hushed stillness as Emma and Daniel stood face to face. The priest's voice droned in the background, but Emma barely registered the words. All she could see was Daniel, the curve of his jaw, the slight tremor in his hand as he held hers. "Emma," Daniel began, his voice thick with emotion. "From the moment I met you, my life changed. You are my strength, my joy, and my greatest adventure. I promise to love you, to stand by you, and to cherish every moment we share. Tears blurred Emma's vision as she responded, her voice wavering. Daniel, you are my heart's home. I promise to walk beside you through every joy and challenge. I will love you fiercely, today and always. A collective sigh swept through the congregation, many dabbing at their eyes. The priest's voice broke through the emotional haze. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Daniel cupped Emma's face, his lips brushing hers in a tender, lingering kiss. Applause erupted, filling the grand space with jubilant energy. As the cheers echoed through the church, Emma caught a flicker of something unsettling in Daniel's eyes. His smile, radiant just moments ago, faltered ever so slightly. His gaze darted toward the back of the church, scanning the crowd with a furtive intensity. Emma's brow furrowed. Daniel, she whispered, her voice barely audible amidst the applause. He snapped his attention back to her, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It's nothing, he assured her, though his voice lacked conviction. Before she could press further, the priest gestured for them to face the congregation. Hand in hand, they walked down the aisle as husband and wife, the weight of Daniel's unease lingering in Emma's chest. The reception venue was a dream, a sprawling terrace overlooking the ocean, where waves shimmered under the setting sun. Tables adorned with cascading floral arrangements and flickering candles created an atmosphere of romance and celebration. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the air as guests toasted the newlyweds. Emma's cheeks ached from smiling, but the joy of the moment was infectious. Daniel twirled her onto the dance floor for their first dance. The music swelled, and they moved as one, their steps graceful and synchronized. Yet Emma couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. As the evening wore on, Emma noticed a shift in Daniel. His laughter sounded hollow, forced. He engaged with guests politely but without his usual warmth. From across the room, Emma watched him, her heart tightening with unease. He seemed distracted, his eyes flickering to the entrance as if expecting someone. Determined to confront her growing doubts, Emma approached him. "Hey," she said softly. "You okay?" Daniel's smile was quick but unconvincing. "Of course. Just a bit overwhelmed, I guess." She searched his face, hoping for reassurance. "It's been a big day," she offered, trying to sound light-hearted. He nodded, but his gaze flickered away. "Yeah, that's all it is." Emma forced herself to accept his words, though a gnawing sense of dread clung to her. The night drew to a close with sparklers illuminating the dark sky. Guests formed a jubilant tunnel, cheering as Emma and Daniel prepared to leave for the honeymoon. Emma clung to Daniel's arm, determined to hold on to the joy of the day. The flickering light danced across his face, momentarily softening the shadows lurking in his eyes. As they waved goodbye and stepped into the waiting car, Emma whispered a silent plea. "Please let this be nothing. Let our happiness last." But deep down, she knew. The storm was only just beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and crimson. The gentle lapping of waves against the dock created a soothing rhythm that blended with the lively hum of the reception. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and joyous toasts filled the air. Daniel leaned close to Emma, his voice low but filled with warmth. "Come with me," he whispered, his hand gently brushing hers. "Just for a minute." She smiled, a flush rising to her cheeks. The weight of the day melted away as they slipped through the crowd, unnoticed by the guests. The dock stretched out before them, illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns. Emma stood at the edge of the dock, her fingers trailing along the smooth wood railing. The breeze tugged at her dress, sending ripples through the delicate fabric. The sky, now a deep indigo, was speckled with stars. She turned, expecting Daniel's familiar silhouette to appear along the path, but the seconds stretched into minutes, and the warmth in her chest began to cool. Her smile faltered. "Daniel?" she called softly, the word swallowed by the night. The only response was the gentle lapping of waves against the dock posts. Her heartbeat quickened, a flicker of concern igniting within her. Emma's sandals clicked against the wooden planks as she hurried back toward the reception. Her pulse raced, each step heavy with growing unease. She scanned the crowd, her eyes darting from face to face. "Have you seen Daniel?" she asked a nearby guest, who shook their head apologetically. A murmur spread through the gathering as others noticed Emma's anxious expression. Concern rippled through the once celebratory atmosphere. Emma's father approached, his brow creased with worry. "What's wrong?" he asked, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "I can't find Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was supposed to meet me at the dock." Flashlights pierced the darkness as search parties formed. The laughter and music of the reception faded into tense silence. Emma's voice wavered as she called out, "Daniel! Daniel, where are you?" Her throat tightened with each unanswered plea. The beams of light swept across the beach, illuminating footprints that led nowhere. The search extended into the woods, shadows dancing ominously among the trees. Twigs snapped beneath their feet, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. Voices echoed off the cliffs, desperate and determined. Near the dock, a guest's flashlight caught a glint on the ground. "Over here," they called, urgency lacing their voice. Emma's heart pounded as she rushed to the spot. Her breath hitched as she saw it. Daniel's phone, lying face down in the dirt, the screen cracked. She knelt, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The phone was cold, lifeless in her palm. Her mind raced, torn between hope and dread. There were no signs of a struggle, only the chilling emptiness of the night. The news spread quickly, shattering the fragile joy of the evening. Guests clustered together, their faces pale with worry. Emma clutched the phone to her chest, her voice breaking as she pleaded with those around her. "We have to find him. He wouldn't just leave. Something's wrong." Her mother wrapped an arm around her, trying to offer comfort, but Emma barely registered the gesture. The world had tilted off its axis, leaving her disoriented and desperate. Disoriented and numb, Emma sank to her knees by the dock, the rough wood pressing against her legs. Her dress pooled around her, damp with evening dew. Memories flooded her mind. Daniel's laughter, the way his eyes sparkled when he looked at her, the warmth of his hand in hers. Each memory clashed with the devastating present. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of uncertainty crushed her. The love they had celebrated just hours ago now felt fragile, torn away by an unseen force. The night stretched endlessly before her, filled with questions that no one could answer. Daniel was gone, and Emma's world would never be the same. The air outside the reception hall had turned still, the celebratory chatter replaced by murmurs of dread. Red and blue lights flashed against the walls, painting the scene with an ominous glow. The guests who had once danced and laughed now stood huddled in small groups, their faces pale and lined with worry. Emma stood near the entrance, her wedding dress now feeling like a cruel reminder of what the day was supposed to be. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet, now slightly wilted, a symbol of a love that felt like it was fading before her eyes. The arrival of the police shattered the fragile silence. Officers stepped out of their vehicles with practiced urgency, their radios crackling with static. The lead detective, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, approached Emma. "Mrs. Harris?" she asked, her voice firm but not unkind. Emma barely managed a nod. Her throat felt dry, her words caught in the storm of her emotions. "We'll take it from here," the detective assured her. "I understand this is overwhelming, but we need to ask some questions and start our investigation immediately." As the officers began to cordon off areas, the reality of the situation hit Emma like a cold wave. This wasn't a bad dream. This was happening. Inside the hall, the mood was tense. Emma watched as the officers moved through the crowd, notepads in hand, asking questions that seemed to hang in the air, like accusations. Her parents were the first to be questioned. Her mother, a composed woman who rarely showed emotion, now looked shaken. "Daniel seemed fine," she stammered. "Maybe a little distracted, but I thought it was just nerves. Weddings can do that to people." Emma's best friend Mia was next. "He was quiet all morning," Mia admitted, glancing nervously at Emma. "I mean, he smiled and said all the right things, but I don't know. It felt like something was on his mind." The officers pressed on, their questions cutting deeper. Did Daniel have any enemies? Was there anything unusual about his behavior recently? Emma's father cleared his throat. "Daniel was a good man. He loved my daughter. If there was something going on, he kept it to himself." But as each person spoke, subtle tensions began to surface. Comments that seemed innocent at first hinted at fractures in the perfect image Daniel had presented. A cousin mentioned a heated phone call Daniel had taken a week ago. Another friend recalled him canceling plans abruptly, claiming he was too busy. Emma listened in silence, her heart pounding. Every word added another piece to a puzzle she didn't want to solve. The detective returned, her expression grim. "Mrs. Harris, we found something you need to see." Emma followed her to a quiet corner of the room, her steps heavy with dread. The detective handed her a series of printed messages, emails and texts that had been flagged as concerning. Each one was more chilling than the last. "You can't escape your past. I know what you did. You'll regret this wedding." Emma's hands shook as she read the messages. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. "These were sent to Daniel over the last month," the detective explained. "It appears he didn't report them to anyone. Do you recognize the sender?" Emma shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No. I had no idea." The detective hesitated before adding, "There's more. We believe these threats might be connected to something from Daniel's past. We're still piecing it together, but it seems he was trying to hide something." Back in the bridal suite, Emma collapsed into a chair, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, her face pale and streaked with tears. How could this be happening? She thought she knew Daniel better than anyone. He was her rock, her partner, her future. And yet, he had hidden an entire world from her. Memories flooded her mind, unbidden and sharp, the way he had brushed off questions about his childhood. The times he seemed lost in thought, a shadow crossing his face when he thought she wasn't looking. She had always chalked it up to stress, to the pressures of life. Had she been blind? Or had he been that good at keeping secrets? The detective knocked gently before entering. "Emma, we've uncovered something else." She handed Emma a folded letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky, and desperate. You can't bury the truth forever, Daniel. It always comes back to haunt you. Emma's breath caught as she read the words. What does this mean? She asked, her voice breaking. We are looking into it, the detective replied. But we found records suggesting Daniel was involved with a dangerous group years ago. He seems to have distanced himself, but someone clearly didn't want him to forget. The room spun as Emma tried to process the information. Who was Daniel? The man she loved or a stranger with a shadowed past? Emma closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her. She saw Daniel laughing as they cooked dinner together, his arms wrapping around her in a warm embrace. She heard his voice, soft and full of love, as he promised her a lifetime of happiness. But now, those moments felt tainted. Were they real, or were they part of a facade he had carefully constructed? She remembered the time he had abruptly ended a phone call when she walked into the room, claiming it was work stuff. The nights he worked late, coming home with a strained smile. The times he avoided questions about his past, changing the subject with practiced ease. Had she ignored the signs? As dawn broke, Emma sat alone, the wedding dress still clinging to her like a ghost of the life she thought she had. The truth was unraveling before her, and it was more painful than she could have imagined. The man she loved, the man she had planned to spend her life with, was a mystery. And yet, her heart ached for him. Despite the lies, the secrets, and the betrayal, she couldn't turn off the love she felt. But now, that love was tinged with doubt. I don't even know who you are, she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking. The investigation was far from over, and Emma knew one thing for certain. The answers would change everything. Days felt like weeks, and weeks like months. Emma couldn't remember when time had started to stretch so thin, when hours seemed to crawl by with no sense of urgency or purpose. The silence in her home was unbearable, the empty rooms echoing with the absence of Daniel. She sat by the window, watching the sun rise and set, wondering if he was out there somewhere, lost but still alive. The phone never rang with the news she desperately hoped for. No word from the police, no sign of him. The investigation had stalled, just like her life. Every knock on the door made her heart leap, only to fall when it was yet another officer, with no new information. Her thoughts spiraled. What was taking so long? Where was Daniel? Was he safe? Was he hurt? The questions pounded in her head like a drum, relentless and unforgiving. The emptiness pressed down on her chest, and with each passing day, the grief settled in deeper. The loss didn't just hurt. It felt like a part of her had been ripped away, leaving an aching hole behind. She couldn't escape the feeling that with every moment, Daniel was slipping further and further from her reach. Then, the media descended. It started small. An occasional news van parked outside her house, a single reporter knocking at her door. But it quickly snowballed. Cameras flashed constantly, their bright lights blinding, microphones shoved in her face as if they were all waiting for her to crack. Mrs. Harris, can you tell us what happened to Daniel? Is there any chance he'll come back? A reporter shouted, his voice cutting through the thick silence of the morning. Emma recoiled, her hands trembling. She couldn't even find the strength to speak. Questions and accusations rained down on her, too many to count. Her thoughts were jumbled, her emotions tangled in confusion, anger, and sorrow. How could they do this? How could they invade her life like this when she herself didn't have the answers? The camera flashes felt like knives, each one striking deeper. She wanted to disappear, to crawl into a hole and never come out. But she couldn't escape. And then came the town's whispers. People she'd known her whole life, people who used to smile at her on the street, now whispered behind her back. She heard fragments of conversation wherever she went, snippets of judgment and suspicion. He's probably off with another woman. She never really knew him. I heard he was in deep with some bad people. Maybe he just ran away. The weight of their words crushed her. The very people who should have supported her were now casting doubt. At the local coffee shop, Emma overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two women she'd known for years were talking in hushed tones, but it was loud enough for her to hear. They say he was hiding something, one woman said, and now he's gone. Maybe he just couldn't keep up the lie anymore. Emma felt her face go red with shame. She wanted to turn around and confront them, to scream at them that they had no idea what she was going through. But instead, she stood frozen, feeling the sting of every whispered word. The town wasn't kind. The rumors swirled like a tornado, growing stronger with each passing day. People who had never met Daniel in their lives had now become experts on his character, inventing stories about him, about their life together, about things that weren't even true. As Emma walked past the gossiping crowds, she felt invisible, like she was standing in the center of a hurricane, the chaos whirling around her, pushing her down until she could hardly breathe. When Emma finally returned home, the weight of the empty house was too much to bear. Every corner of it held a memory, a dream of the life she and Daniel had planned. She wandered from room to room, touching the things that had once felt so full of promise. On the kitchen counter lay the invitation to their honeymoon. Paris, a place they'd always dreamed of visiting together. Now, it was nothing but paper and ink, a dream that would never be realized. She found their wedding plans scattered across the dining table. Photos, sketches, lists of details they'd poured their hearts into. Now they were just reminders of a life that had been stolen away. In their bedroom, Emma ran her fingers along the edge of the bed, the place where they had spent so many nights together, wrapped in each other's arms. Now, it felt like a distant memory, a piece of a life she no longer recognized. Packing up the shared dreams felt like breaking apart her very soul. She stuffed the wedding albums into a box, then paused, tears slipping down her cheeks as she grabbed the honeymoon tickets. She couldn't keep them. She couldn't keep any of it. With each item she put away, a piece of herself was torn away too. What was left of the future they had planned? As evening fell, Emma found herself standing at the old dock where she and Daniel had shared so many quiet moments. It was where they had first met, where they had talked about their hopes and dreams for the future. Now it felt like the place where everything had ended. The wind whipped through her hair, but it felt distant, detached, like everything around her had become a blur. The water, once a symbol of life and possibility, now seemed cold and indifferent. She stared out over the lake, the reflection of the fading sun, just a faint glow on the surface. She had to admit it. Maybe Daniel was never coming back. Maybe he had chosen to disappear, to leave her behind. But as the tears welled up in her eyes, she realized something. Standing here, at the edge of everything, she wasn't just letting go of him. She was letting go of the life they had. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she couldn't keep holding on to the past. The pain was still there, sharp and raw. But the first steps toward healing had begun. Emma took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs. The grief was still there, still heavy in her chest, but it wasn't all-consuming anymore. She understood now. She couldn't keep trying to find answers that might never come. She couldn't wait for Daniel to return. Because the truth was, she didn't know if he ever would. The water in front of her glimmered in the fading light, and she made a decision. It was time to let go. The pain wouldn't disappear overnight, and she would never stop missing him. But in this moment by the dock, she felt a small flicker of hope. She could move forward. She could survive. And for the first time since Daniel's disappearance, Emma allowed herself a quiet, painful but hopeful sigh. The journey toward healing had begun, and though it would be long and hard, she knew that somehow she would find a way to move on. The sun had barely begun to rise when Emma received the call. Her hands shook as she held the phone to her ear, the voice on the other end calm but urgent. "We've found something, Emma. We've uncovered new evidence. We're going to need you to come with us." Her heart hammered in her chest as the officer explained that the search had taken a new turn. Police had traced a lead to a remote cabin, miles outside of town. It was a small, isolated place, one that hadn't been on any maps, and one that made Emma's stomach twist with fear. Tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Was this it? Was this the moment that could bring her answers? Emma couldn't tell if the sudden rush of hope was a blessing or a curse. Every part of her wanted to believe it, but the pit in her stomach warned her that hope and dread could so easily blur into one. The thought of Daniel, still out there, made her heart ache. And now they might be close to finding him. She pushed her doubt aside, grabbed her jacket, and stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin as she made her way to the car. This could be it. She might finally find out what had happened to the man she thought she knew. The cabin was as isolated as they had described, hidden among thick trees, far from any sign of civilization. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she approached the building, her pulse quickening with every step. The door was ajar when they arrived, and the officers moved quickly inside, their voices hushed but tense. Emma stayed close behind them, fear creeping into her chest. She could feel her legs shaking, but she pushed forward. It was there, in the dim light of the cabin, that Emma saw him. Daniel. He was lying on a small cot, his face pale and his eyes barely open. His body looked thin, bruised and battered. Emma's heart stopped in her chest as she stepped closer. His clothes were torn, his hair matted with dirt and sweat. It was clear that his escape had taken a toll on him, but what terrified her more was how lifeless he appeared. The officers explained that Daniel was in a state of shock. He didn't speak much, his eyes flickering between confusion and fear. When he did speak, his words were barely audible, as if the world around him was too overwhelming to process. Emma's mind raced. He was alive, but he was hurt. And something about the look in his eyes told her that he had been through something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Over the next few days, Daniel's condition improved, though his mind was still a fractured mess. Emma stayed by his side, holding his hand through the long nights. When he finally spoke, it wasn't in the way she had hoped. There were no sweet words or loving reassurances. Instead, his voice was broken, distant. "I'm sorry. I never wanted you to find out like this." Emma sat beside him, her heart heavy. She had always known Daniel was secretive, but this This was something else entirely. As the truth began to spill out, Emma could hardly believe what she was hearing. Daniel had been involved with a dangerous criminal group, people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. They had threatened him, blackmailed him, and driven him to the edge of his sanity. The pressure had been so overwhelming that he'd made the decision to disappear, to fake his own death and leave Emma behind. Daniel's past, filled with violence and deceit, was slowly being exposed, each new detail worse than the last. Emma struggled to process the information, each revelation chipping away at the foundation of the life they had shared. She thought she had known him. She thought they had been building a future together. But now, everything she believed in felt like a lie. As Emma listened to Daniel's confession, her chest tightened. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he hadn't trusted her, why he hadn't come to her for help. But his next words stopped her. "I did it to protect you, Emma. I thought if I stayed, if I told you what was really going on, they'd hurt you too." His eyes were filled with sorrow, his voice cracking under the weight of his regret. "I couldn't let you get caught in that world. I thought it would be easier for you if you moved on. If I just disappeared." Emma's heart twisted. She couldn't believe it. Daniel had chosen to disappear, to leave her without a word because he thought it was the only way to keep her safe. He thought she would be better off without him, even if it meant breaking her heart in the process. His love for her had led him to make the most painful choice of all. The weight of it all pressed down on Emma's chest, suffocating her. Part of her wanted to believe him, to understand the depth of his sacrifice. But the other part of her felt betrayed. She had spent weeks, months even, wondering where he was, what had happened. All the pain, all the confusion, it had been for nothing. As she replayed their life together in her mind, every memory felt tainted. Their quiet moments, the way he had held her, the plans they had made, now they felt like nothing but shadows. Had she been in love with a man who didn't truly exist? Emma's emotions were a storm, swirling and crashing within her. She wanted to scream at him for leaving her in the dark. But a part of her still loved him, still wanted to believe that their life together was real. When Emma finally confronted Daniel, the room was thick with tension. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, her heart pounding in her chest. "How could you do this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "How could you leave me like that?" Daniel's face twisted with guilt, his eyes brimming with pain. "I never wanted to hurt you, Emma. I thought you'd be better off without me." "You thought?" she echoed bitterly. "You thought? You took everything from me. You didn't trust me. You didn't think I could handle it." Their voices clashed, the words heavy and painful. The love they once shared was still there, but it was tangled with anger and betrayal, and the air between them crackled with all the things left unsaid. In that moment, the weight of everything they had been through hit them both. Their love was still there, but it was now broken, shattered by secrets and lies. Emma stood at the crossroads of her heart and mind, torn between the love she still felt for Daniel and the betrayal that now defined their relationship. Could she forgive him? Could she rebuild what was lost? Or would she have to walk away, knowing that the man she had loved was not the man she thought he was? The weight of the decision crushed her. How could she move forward? How could she even begin to trust again? She looked at Daniel, his face filled with regret and sorrow, and for a moment, it felt like everything had stopped. She had no answers, no clear path, The future was uncertain, and her heart was still broken. With a final lingering look at the man she once knew, Emma turned away, unsure of what would come next. The silence between Emma and Daniel was heavy. The weight of the past hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Emma stared out the window, her eyes unfocused, but her mind racing with everything she had learned. How could she even begin to process it all? Daniel sat across from her, his gaze fixed on his hands. He had apologized over and over, but the hurt still felt fresh. It was hard to know what to say, how to bridge the gap that now existed between them. There was a yearning between them, a pull toward reconciliation, but it felt distant, unreachable. I don't know how to move forward, Emma whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. I want to trust you, Daniel, but I don't know if I can. Daniel's throat tightened, and for a moment he was speechless. He had betrayed her trust. He had kept secrets from her. The shame of it made his chest ache. But he loved her. He always had, and he was willing to do whatever it took to prove it. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Daniel said, his voice rough. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try, Emma. I need you to know I'm here, for as long as it takes. They sat there, their hearts heavy, but neither of them willing to give up. The road to healing was unclear, and the scars of the past were still fresh, but they both knew something important had shifted. There was hope, fragile, but it was there. The days after their confrontation were filled with tension, but also a strange sense of honesty. Emma and Daniel tried, for the first time, to speak openly about their pain. Emma found herself telling him things she hadn't known she needed to say. I felt abandoned, she admitted one evening, her voice small. Like you chose to disappear, to leave me to pick up the pieces of a life I thought we were building together. You didn't even give me the chance to help you. Daniel listened, his face etched with regret. I never meant to make you feel that way, he said quietly. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now how wrong I was. It was hard, so hard, to hear him admit the depth of his mistakes, to listen to him say the words she had longed to hear. Yet the pain she felt in her heart was still there, raw and real. She had so many questions. Why hadn't he trusted her? Why hadn't he let her in? I need time, Daniel, she said softly, the tears threatening to spill. I can't just forget, and I don't know if I can ever truly forgive, but I want to try. I want to understand you. Daniel reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it touched hers. I'll wait, Emma. I'll do whatever it takes. Their shared vulnerability didn't erase the scars, but it began to open a path toward healing. Slowly, bit by bit, they started to see each other not as victims of their circumstances, but as two people who still cared. Deeply, even if that care had been hidden beneath layers of pain. It wasn't easy, but over time, Emma and Daniel found small ways to reconnect. They spent more quiet evenings together, sitting side by side, talking about their past and what they wanted for their future. Sometimes they just held hands, no words needed. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emma let out a deep breath, her eyes softening as she looked at him. Do you remember when we used to talk about our future? About the house we were going to build? The trips we'd take? Daniel nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. I remember. I still think about that sometimes. Emma's heart swelled with emotion. The dreams they had shared weren't gone. They were just waiting. and the love they had once had was still there, buried beneath the hurt and confusion, but it was strong enough to survive. Maybe we can build something together again, Emma said softly, her voice filled with a quiet hope. Daniel squeezed her hand, his heart lifting with the thought, I want that more than anything. In that moment, they didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. And that, for the first time in a long while, felt like enough. A few weeks later, Emma and Daniel found themselves standing at the same dock where Daniel had once disappeared, the place that had become a symbol of their pain. But now, as the wind gently ruffled the hair and the sun dipped below the horizon, the dock held a different meaning, a symbol of their resilience, their second chance. They stood facing each other, their hands intertwined. Daniel looked into Emma's eyes, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Emma, he began, I know I've hurt you. I know I can't change the past, but I want to move forward with you. I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much you mean to me. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she gazed at him. Daniel, I still love you. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to try. I want to face it with you. With those simple words, they renewed their vows, not in a grand ceremony, but in a quiet, intimate promise to each other. A promise to rebuild, to heal, and to cherish the love that had once been broken but never truly lost. As the ceremony ended, Emma and Daniel stood side by side, gazing out over the water. The air was calm now, and the tension between them had eased. They had faced their demons, fought through their pain, and emerged stronger. We made it, Emma whispered, her voice filled with a quiet joy. Daniel squeezed her hand. We're not done yet, but we're together, and that's enough for me. Together, they walked away from the dock, leaving behind the uncertainty and fear. Their future was still unwritten, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt hopeful. They had faced their darkest moments, and they had come out the other side, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. And as they walked into the future, they knew that whatever challenges they encountered, their love, though scarred, was strong enough to carry them forward.